Have you ever been in a moment where protecting someone else mattered more than your own safety? Maybe you're watching this from a small town where everyone looks out for each other. Or perhaps you're in a big city where strangers pass by without a second glance. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because this story is about what happens when a single act of courage changes everything. Isabella Romano wiped down another sticky table, her third double shift this week blurring into an endless cycle of demanding customers and impossible expectations. At 24, she'd already lived through more heartbreak and terror than most people experienced in a lifetime, but she kept moving forward because stopping meant letting the memories catch up. The bruises from Elena Santos had faded months ago, but the fear of him finding her never quite disappeared. The dinner rush at Romano's restaurant was particularly brutal tonight. Every table packed with families and couples enjoying their Friday evening, while Izzy rushed between orders with a smile she didn't feel. Her manager, Tony DeMarco, prowled the dining room like a shark looking for any excuse to unleash his famous temper. She'd learned to stay invisible when he was in one of his moods, to keep her head down and do her job perfectly so he couldn't find fault. Her feet ached in the cheap shoes she couldn't afford to replace, and her uniform clung uncomfortably to her skin in the overheated restaurant. The tips tonight had been decent, but not nearly enough to cover her rent and the student loans that haunted her mailbox every month. She needed this job desperately, even if it meant enduring Tony's verbal abuse and the constant stress of walking on eggshells around his unpredictable temperament. A small voice caught her attention from the corner booth, a little girl sitting alone with an untouched plate of chicken fingers in front of her. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and wide brown eyes that seemed too serious for her age. She wore an expensive-looking dress that stood out among the casual dining crowd, and she kept glancing toward the entrance as if waiting for someone important. Izzy found herself drawn to the child's table, something maternal in her responding to the girl's obvious nervousness. She's probably waiting for her parents, Izzy thought, but there was something about the child's posture that suggested she was used to being alone in adult spaces. The way she sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, spoke of careful training and perhaps too much experience with formal situations. That's when Tony's voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife, sharp and cruel in a way that made several nearby diners look up in alarm. "You're taking up valuable real estate, kid. This isn't a babysitting service." The little girl's eyes went wide with fear, her small hands trembling as she reached for her purse. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My father said he'd be right back. He's just parking the car." Tony leaned over the table, his bulk intimidating even to adults, let alone a frightened child. "Your father can find you at the host stand. This table is for paying customers, not charity cases who order a kid's meal and nurse it for an hour." Something white-hot ignited in Izzy's chest, a protective fury that overrode every instinct for self-preservation she'd carefully cultivated since escaping Elena. Before she could think about the consequences, before she could remember that she needed this job more than her next breath, she was moving toward the confrontation with purpose. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying more authority than she felt. "The little girl is a paying customer, and she's not bothering anyone." Tony whirled around, his face already flushing red with the anger that had gotten him fired from 3 previous restaurants. "Romano, stay out of this. Go bus your tables and keep your mouth shut." But Izzy couldn't stay out of it, couldn't walk away from a child being bullied by a man who used his size and position to intimidate people who couldn't fight back. She'd been that frightened person too many times to count. Had felt that same helpless terror when Elena would tower over her with his fists clenched and his voice raised in preparation for violence. "She's 8 years old," Izzy said, stepping between Tony and the little girl's table. "She's sitting quietly, she's not causing any problems, and her father will be here any minute. There's absolutely no reason to upset her like this." The little girl looked up at Izzy with something like wonder, as if she'd never seen an adult stand up for her before. "Thank you," she said softly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You're not causing any trouble, sweetheart," Izzy assured her, keeping her voice gentle while her heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel Tony's rage building behind her like a gathering storm, but she refused to back down. Some things were more important than job security, and protecting a child from adult cruelty was definitely one of them. Tony's hand slammed down on the table hard enough to make the silverware jump, causing the little girl to flinch and several nearby customers to stop eating entirely. You want to be a hero, Romano? Fine. You're fired. Clean out your locker and get out of my restaurant. And don't even think about using me as a reference, because I'll make sure every restaurant in this city knows what kind of insubordinate troublemaker you are. The words hit her like a physical blow, the reality of her situation crashing down with devastating clarity. She was broke, behind on rent, and now unemployed because she couldn't stand by and watch a child be terrorized. But even as panic began to set in, even as she calculated how many days she had before eviction, she couldn't bring herself to regret her choice. The little girl was looking at her with tears in her eyes, and Izzy managed to smile despite her own internal collapse. "It's going to be okay," she said, reaching out to gently squeeze the child's hand. "Don't let him scare you. You have every right to be here." Security appeared as if summoned. Two large men who looked uncomfortable with their assignment but unwilling to disobey Tony's orders. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," one of them said, not unkindly. As they escorted her toward the exit, Izzy heard the little girl call out behind her. "Thank you for helping me. My father will want to thank you too." The words followed her out into the cool evening air, where she stood on the sidewalk trying to process what had just happened. She'd lost her job protecting a stranger's child, and she didn't even know the girl's name. The rational part of her mind screamed that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she should have minded her own business and kept her head down like she'd learned to do with Elena. But the look of gratitude in that little girl's eyes made it impossible to feel anything but satisfaction. She'd finally stood up to a bully instead of cowering in fear, and it felt like the first truly brave thing she'd done since escaping her abusive relationship. Even if it meant facing financial ruin, even if it meant starting over again from nothing, she'd proven to herself that she was stronger than her fears. The restaurant door opened behind her, and she turned to see a man stepping out into the evening light. He was tall and imposing in an expensive suit that fit him like it had been tailored specifically for his broad shoulders and lean frame. His dark hair was styled with understated elegance, and there was something about his presence that commanded attention without effort. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, green-gray and intelligent, studying her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of her rumpled uniform and tear-stained cheeks. Behind him came the little girl, no longer frightened but walking with quiet confidence at his side. The transformation was immediate and striking, as if his mere presence had restored her sense of safety and belonging. This was clearly a child who knew she was loved and protected, despite whatever circumstances had left her dining alone. The man's gaze moved from Izzy to his daughter and back again, and she saw something shift in his expression. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of what had transpired in his absence. His hand settled protectively on the little girl's shoulder, and Izzy found herself wondering what kind of work kept a father away long enough for his child to finish an entire meal alone. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that suggested people listened when he spoke, "that I owe you a conversation." Vincent Torino studied the young woman standing on the sidewalk, taking in details that most people would miss. The way she held herself despite obvious exhaustion, the pride in her posture even after being publicly humiliated and fired. Her uniform was wrinkled and her hair had escaped its ponytail during the confrontation, but there was something in her dark eyes that spoke of steel wrapped in silk. Most people cowered when faced with Tony DeMarco's bullying, but this girl had stepped between a grown man and a child without hesitation. Sophia tugged on his jacket sleeve, drawing his attention back to the little girl who rarely spoke to strangers but had apparently found her voice tonight. "Papa," she whispered, "this is the lady who helped me." She was very brave. The simple words carried weight that Sophia couldn't possibly understand. In Vincent's world, loyalty and protection were currencies more valuable than money, and this stranger had just demonstrated both without expecting anything in return. He crouched down to Sophia's eye level, noting how she glanced between him and the waitress with obvious concern. "Did you thank her properly, Principessa?" he asked, using the pet name that never failed to make his daughter smile. Sophia nodded solemnly. I did, but I think she's sad now because of what that mean man said to her. Vincent rose to his full height, his gaze returning to the young woman who was clearly trying to decide whether to stay or flee. She looked like a rabbit caught between predators, uncertain which direction offered safety. The protective instinct that drove everything he did for Sophia was stirring in response to her obvious vulnerability, though he couldn't quite explain why. Miss, he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention without aggression. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Vincent, Sophia's father. Isabella Romano, she replied, her voice steadier than he'd expected given the circumstances. Most people called her Izzy, but something about this man's formal demeanor made her offer her full name instead. She found herself studying his face, trying to read the expression in those unusual green-gray eyes. Vincent extended his hand, noting how she hesitated before accepting the gesture. Her handshake was firm despite the slight tremor he could feel, and he caught the faint scent of vanilla and exhaustion that seemed to cling to her skin. Everything about her suggested someone who worked hard for every dollar, who understood struggle in a way that most people in his circle never would. Sophia tells me you defended her against that man inside, he said, releasing her hand but maintaining eye contact. In my experience, that kind of courage isn't common, especially when it comes at personal cost. Isabella's cheeks flushed slightly, whether from embarrassment or lingering adrenaline he couldn't tell. Anyone would have done the same thing, she said, though they both knew that wasn't true. Most people would have looked the other way, unwilling to risk their own security for a stranger's child. I think you'd be surprised how few people would risk their livelihood for someone they don't know, Vincent replied. Sophia is very important to me, Miss Romano. The fact that you protected her when I wasn't here to do it myself means more than you might realize. Sophia stepped closer to Isabella, her small hand reaching out to touch the woman's fingers in a gesture of comfort that surprised them both. You don't have to be sad, she said with the earnest conviction that only children possessed. My papa can fix things. He's very good at fixing things. The innocent statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Isabella couldn't quite grasp but Vincent understood perfectly. Sophia had grown up in a world where problems disappeared when her father willed it, where his word was law and his protection was absolute. She had no concept of the limitations that governed most people's lives. I'm afraid some things can't be fixed, sweetheart, Isabella said gently, crouching down to Sophia's level. But thank you for caring. That means a lot to me. Vincent watched the interaction with growing interest, noting how naturally Isabella connected with his daughter despite her own obvious distress. Sophia was typically shy around strangers, especially after her mother's death had taught her that adults could disappear without warning. But something about this woman's genuine warmth had broken through her usual reserve. Have you eaten dinner yet? He asked suddenly, the question surprising all three of them. Sophia and I were planning to find somewhere quieter to finish our meal, and after what happened inside, I suspect you could use some time to decompress. Isabella's stomach chose that moment to remind her that she'd been working for 8 hours without a proper break. But accepting charity from strangers felt dangerous in ways she couldn't articulate. This man radiated the kind of controlled power that set her nerves on edge, though not in the same way Elena's volatility had. Where her ex-boyfriend's strength had been unpredictable and cruel, Vincent's presence suggested protection rather than threat. I should probably get home, she said, though they both knew she had nowhere urgent to be. The truth was that her empty apartment held nothing but bills she couldn't pay and memories she'd rather avoid. Sophia looked disappointed, her small face falling in a way that tugged at Isabella's heart. Please come with us, she said with the kind of hopeful sincerity that was impossible to resist. I want to hear more about how you became so brave. The compliment struck something deep in Isabella's chest, a part of her that had been beaten down by Elena's constant criticism and manipulation. When was the last time someone had called her brave? When had anyone seen strength in her actions rather than defiance that needed to be punished? Vincent seemed to sense her internal struggle, his voice softening in a way that suggested he understood more about her situation than a stranger should. There's a quiet place about 2 blocks from here, he said. Good food, private booths where we can talk without interruption. No obligations, no expectations. Just a meal between three people who've had an eventful evening. The rational part of Isabella's mind screamed warnings about accepting invitations from mysterious wealthy men, especially ones whose 80-year-old daughters dined alone in expensive restaurants while their fathers conducted unnamed business. But the exhausted, frightened part of her that had just lost her only source of income was drawn to the promise of kindness without strings attached. Have you ever faced a choice between safety and survival, where every option seemed dangerous but staying still felt like giving up? Sometimes the scariest decision is the one that offers hope when you've gotten used to expecting disappointment. Vincent's phone buzzed against his jacket, and he glanced at the screen with the kind of focused attention that suggested important business. "One moment," he said, stepping slightly away to take the call. "Marcus, what is it?" Isabella couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Vincent's expression shift into something harder, more focused. His responses were brief and coded in a way that told her nothing while confirming her suspicions that his business dealings weren't entirely conventional. "Understood," he said finally. "Handle it quietly. I'll be in touch within the hour." When he returned his attention to Isabella and Sophia, his demeanor had shifted slightly, though his daughter seemed unaware of any change. The man who had been offering casual dinner invitations was gone, replaced by someone who clearly had pressing responsibilities elsewhere. "I'm afraid something urgent has come up," he said, though his tone suggested regret rather than dismissal. "However, I find myself in an unusual situation, Miss Romano, and I wonder if you might be willing to help me solve a problem." Isabella's wariness returned full force, every instinct telling her that whatever he was about to propose would complicate her life in ways she wasn't prepared to handle. But Sophia was looking between them with obvious hope, and the promise of employment was too tempting to dismiss without hearing the details. "What kind of problem?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. Vincent's smile was slight but genuine, acknowledging her courage in asking direct questions when most people would have either fled or agreed blindly. "Sophia enjoys fine dining, as you might have guessed, but she doesn't always enjoy the business conversations that accompany my dinner meetings. I'm looking for someone who could serve as her companion during these events, someone who could keep her comfortable and engaged while I handle necessary conversations." The job offer was so unexpected that Isabella could only stare at him for several heartbeats, trying to process what he was really asking. A private waitress for business dinners with a man whose phone calls were coded and whose 80-year-old daughter apparently attended formal events on a regular basis. "I don't have any formal experience with that kind of work," she said carefully, unwilling to lie about her qualifications but desperately needing to know more about what he was offering. "Sophia has already given you the highest recommendation I could ask for," Vincent replied. "She's an excellent judge of character, and she clearly trusts you. The work would be well compensated, and I suspect it would be considerably more pleasant than dealing with managers like the one inside." The promise of decent money was almost too good to be true, but Isabella's hard-won caution demanded more information before she could even consider accepting. "What kind of business meetings?" she asked. "And how often would this arrangement be necessary?" Vincent's appreciation for her directness showed in his expression, confirming her suspicion that most people in his world didn't ask uncomfortable questions. "Various professional obligations," he said smoothly. "Perhaps 3 or 4 evenings per month, always in respectable establishments, always with advance notice so you can plan accordingly." The offer was generous enough to solve her immediate financial crisis while giving her time to search for more permanent employment, but something about the careful way he phrased his answers suggested there were details he wasn't sharing. Still, Sophia was looking at her with such obvious hope, and the prospect of earning enough money to keep her apartment was too important to dismiss out of hand. "If I were to consider this," she said slowly, "I would need to establish some ground rules about boundaries and expectations." "Of course," Vincent agreed immediately. "Your comfort and safety would be my primary concerns, Miss Romano. Sophia's happiness would be impossible to maintain if you were uncomfortable or unhappy with the arrangement." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Isabella found herself believing that he meant what he said about her safety being important. But she'd learned the hard way that men's promises could change without warning, and she wasn't about to put herself in a vulnerable position without clear agreements. "I'll need a few days to think about it," she said, knowing that her empty bank account and overdue rent notice didn't really give her the luxury of extended consideration. "Take all the time you need," Vincent said, though something in his expression suggested he expected her answer sooner rather than later. "In the meantime, may I offer you my card? In case you have any questions or concerns about the position." The business card he handed her was elegant and expensive, with only his name and a phone number embossed in simple black letters. No company name, no title, nothing to indicate what kind of business required coded phone calls and formal dinner meetings with 80-year-old companions. "Thank you," she said, tucking the card into her uniform pocket. "I'll be in touch soon." Sophia stepped forward to hug Isabella's legs in a gesture of affection that surprised all three of them, her small voice muffled against the wrinkled fabric. "I hope you say yes," she whispered. "I think we could be good friends." The words followed Isabella all the way home to her empty apartment, where she sat staring at Vincent's business card and wondering if she was about to make the best or worst decision of her life. 3 days later, Isabella stood in the marble lobby of the most expensive building she'd ever entered. Her reflection multiplied endlessly in the polished surfaces that surrounded her. The doorman had greeted her by name, which meant Vincent had prepared his staff for her arrival in a way that suggested this arrangement was more significant than a simple babysitting job. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her best dress, a simple black number that had seemed elegant in her tiny apartment but felt woefully inadequate in these surroundings. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt endless, each floor marking her journey further from the world she understood and deeper into territory that both thrilled and terrified her. When the doors opened directly into Vincent's home, she stepped into a space that redefined her concept of luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, while modern furniture that probably cost more than she'd made in the past year was arranged with casual elegance throughout the expansive living area. "Miss Romano," a gentle voice called from across the room. She turned to see an older woman approaching with a warm smile, her gray hair styled in an elegant chignon and her clothing suggesting both professionalism and maternal warmth. "I'm Mrs. Chun, the household manager. Mr. Torino is finishing a phone call, but he asked me to make you comfortable and show you around." The tour that followed left Isabella increasingly overwhelmed by the scope of Vincent's wealth and the quiet efficiency with which his household operated. The kitchen could have served a restaurant, the dining room seated 12 with crystal and china that belonged in a museum, and Sophia's bedroom was larger than Isabella's entire apartment. But it was the family photographs scattered throughout the space that caught her attention, images of Vincent and Sophia with a beautiful woman whose absence was palpable in every frame. "That was my mother," Sophia said quietly, appearing beside Isabella as she studied a photo of the three of them at what appeared to be a beach vacation. "She died when I was 5, so I don't remember very much about her, but Papa says she would have liked you." The simple statement carried a weight that made Isabella's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She couldn't imagine the kind of loss that would leave such a profound hole in a family, couldn't fathom how Vincent had managed to raise a daughter while clearly running some kind of demanding business empire. The evidence of his devotion to Sophia was everywhere, from the photographs that captured moments of pure joy to the way he'd arranged his schedule around her needs. "Your father loves you very much," Isabella said softly, crouching down to Sophia's eye level. "That's easy to see just from being in this house for a few minutes." Sophia nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to emotional truths. "He does, but sometimes he gets lonely when I'm sleeping or at school. I think maybe if he had a friend like you, he wouldn't be sad so much." The innocent observation hit Isabella like a physical blow, revealing depths to Vincent's character that his controlled exterior had hidden. She was still processing Sophia's words when the man himself appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately commanding attention even in casual conversation with his daughter. "Principessa," he said, his voice carrying the kind of warm affection that transformed his entire demeanor. "I see you've been giving Miss Romano the complete tour." Isabella watched the interaction between father and daughter with growing fascination, noting how Vincent's formal business mask dissolved completely when he focused on Sophia. This was a man who would move mountains for his child, who had somehow managed to create a sanctuary of love and safety in what she was beginning to suspect was a very dangerous world. The first business dinner was scheduled for that evening, and Isabella spent the afternoon learning the subtle choreography that governed Vincent's formal entertaining. Mrs. Chun explained the protocol with patient thoroughness, describing how Isabella's role involved more than simple service. She would be responsible for Sophia's comfort and entertainment during the adult conversations, ensuring the little girl remained engaged and happy throughout what could be lengthy proceedings. When the guests arrived, Isabella's suspicions about Vincent's true occupation crystallized into certainty. These weren't conventional businessmen discussing quarterly reports and market projections. The men who entered his dining room moved with the kind of controlled awareness that suggested familiarity with violence, spoke in careful euphemisms that revealed nothing while communicating everything, and treated Vincent with a deference that went far beyond normal professional respect. From her position at the kitchen counter, helping Sophia with a coloring book while the adults conducted their meeting, Isabella could observe without appearing to listen. Vincent commanded the conversation with quiet authority, his voice never rising but his words carrying the weight of final decisions. When disagreements arose, the other men looked to him for resolution, accepting his judgments without question or argument. "He's very important, isn't he?" Sophia whispered, following Isabella's gaze toward the dining room where her father was speaking with measured intensity about territories and obligations and consequences. "Yes, sweetheart, he is," Isabella replied, though she was beginning to understand that Vincent's importance came with a price that extended far beyond money or social status. This was power built on foundations that most people never saw, supported by loyalties that were tested in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. The evening progressed with careful precision, Vincent managing both his business obligations and his attention to Sophia with practiced ease. During breaks in the formal discussions, he would appear in the kitchen to check on his daughter, his entire demeanor shifting from commanding authority to gentle father in the space between one room and another. Isabella found herself fascinated by the transformation, wondering how many people ever got to see both sides of his complex personality. After the guests departed and Sophia was tucked into bed with stories and kisses that spoke of bedtime rituals perfected over years of single parenting, Vincent invited Isabella to join him for coffee in his study. The room was masculine and comfortable, lined with books that suggested both education and practical intelligence, dominated by a desk that clearly served as command central for whatever empire he operated. "You have questions," he said without preamble, settling into a leather chair across from the couch where she perched nervously. "I can see them in your expression, and you have every right to answers before you decide whether to continue this arrangement." Isabella took a careful sip of coffee that was better than anything she'd ever tasted, using the moment to gather courage for conversations she wasn't sure she wanted to have. "What exactly do you do for a living?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. Vincent's smile was slight but genuine, acknowledging her bravery in asking the question that most people would have avoided. "I manage interests for my family," he said carefully. "Some of those interests are more traditional than others, but all of them require careful attention to detail and absolute loyalty from the people I work with." The careful phrasing told her everything and nothing, confirming her suspicions while avoiding specifics that could implicate either of them in uncomfortable truths. She wasn't naive enough to believe his business dealings were entirely legal, but she was beginning to understand that his moral code was more complex than simple criminality. "Are you asking because you're concerned for your safety, or because you're trying to decide whether you can work for someone whose methods you might not approve of?" Vincent asked, his green-gray eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity. "Both," Isabella admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "I spent most of my life trying to stay invisible, trying to avoid dangerous situations and unpredictable people. But Sophia needs someone who cares about her, and you've been nothing but respectful and generous with me." Vincent's expression softened at the mention of his daughter, confirming Isabella's growing suspicion that Sophia was the key to understanding everything about this complicated man. "Everything I do is ultimately about protecting her and providing for her future," he said quietly. "Some of the methods required might seem harsh to someone outside this world, but I've never taken action that wasn't justified by necessity. The conversation was interrupted by Isabella's phone buzzing insistently against the coffee table where she'd left it. The number on the screen made her blood run cold, every muscle in her body tensing with remembered fear as Elena Santos's name appeared in letters that seemed to burn against her eyes. "Is everything all right?" Vincent asked, his tone shifting immediately from casual conversation to sharp concern as he noted her obvious distress. Isabella's hands shook as she declined the call, but the damage was already done. Elena knew she was in the city, knew enough about her current situation to track her down despite all her careful precautions. The voicemail notification appeared almost immediately, and she found herself frozen with terror at the prospect of hearing his voice again after months of blessed silence. "Miss Romano," Vincent said gently, moving from his chair to sit beside her on the couch. "Whatever just frightened you, you don't have to face it alone." His proximity was both comforting and overwhelming, the solid warmth of his presence offering a kind of protection she hadn't experienced since childhood. But the rational part of her mind screamed warnings about involving this dangerous man in her personal problems, about dragging his family into the chaos that Elena's reappearance would inevitably bring. "It's my ex-boyfriend," she whispered, the words scraping against her throat like broken glass. "He's been calling and texting since yesterday. I thought I'd lost him when I moved here, but somehow he found me." Vincent's expression darkened in a way that suggested Elena Santos had just made a very serious mistake, though his voice remained gentle when he spoke. "Has he threatened you? Tried to hurt you before?" The questions opened floodgates that Isabella had kept carefully sealed for months, memories of fear and pain and helplessness spilling out in broken sentences that revealed more than she'd intended to share. Vincent listened without interruption, his presence steady and reassuring while she relived nightmare experiences she'd never spoken about to anyone. When she finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted from the revelation, Vincent's hand covered hers with careful gentleness. "No one will hurt you again," he said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that made promises feel like guarantees. "Not while you're under my protection." The words should have felt like manipulation, like another man trying to control her choices through promises of safety. But something in Vincent's tone, in the careful way he waited for her consent rather than simply taking charge, suggested genuine care rather than possessive control. "I can handle this," she said weakly, though they both knew Elena's escalating behavior was beyond her ability to manage alone. "You shouldn't have to," Vincent replied. "And more importantly, Sophia shouldn't have to worry about someone threatening the person she's already decided to trust." The mention of his daughter reframed everything, reminding Isabella that her problems were no longer hers alone. Sophia had already begun bonding with her, already started to rely on her presence for comfort and companionship. Whatever Elena intended, his actions could impact an innocent child who had already lost too much. "What are you suggesting?" Isabella asked, though part of her already knew what Vincent was offering and why accepting his help might be both the safest and most dangerous decision she could make. "Stay here tonight," he said simply. "Let me make some calls and ensure your safety while you decide what you want to do long-term. No obligations, no expectations beyond keeping Sophia happy and allowing me to protect you both." The offer was everything she needed and everything she'd spent months running from, safety that came with complications she couldn't begin to understand. But Elena's voice on that voicemail would contain threats that made living alone increasingly impossible, and Sophia's innocent trust demanded protection that extended beyond simple employment arrangements. Looking into Vincent's eyes, seeing the genuine concern and careful respect in his expression, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. "All right," she said softly, "just for tonight." But they both knew that some decisions, once made, couldn't be easily undone. 3 weeks of living in Vincent's world had created a routine that felt both natural and surreal, a delicate balance between the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together and the surprisingly ordinary moments that filled their days. Isabella had settled into her role with Sophia more easily than she'd expected, finding genuine joy in the little girl's company and discovering maternal instincts she hadn't known she possessed. The penthouse had begun to feel less like a luxury hotel and more like the home she'd never had, though she constantly reminded herself that this arrangement was temporary. Sophia was curled up beside her on the living room couch, working through a math worksheet while Isabella reviewed the latest job listings on her laptop. The comfortable silence between them was broken when Sophia looked up with the kind of serious expression that usually preceded important questions. "Isabella," she said carefully, using the full name she decided sounded more grown-up than Izzy. "Do you think you might want to stay here forever? Not just for work, but like a real family?" The innocent question hit Isabella like a physical blow, revealing depths of longing she'd been trying to ignore for weeks. Sophia's hope was written clearly across her small face, and the trust implicit in her words made Isabella's chest tight with emotion she wasn't prepared to process. How did you explain to an 80-year-old that forever was a luxury that people like Isabella couldn't afford, that fairy tales belonged in books rather than real life? "Sweetheart," she said gently, setting aside her laptop to focus completely on the conversation. "Your father and I have a work arrangement. When he doesn't need my help anymore, I'll have to find my own place again. But what if he always needs your help?" Sophia pressed, her logic carrying the kind of simple clarity that adults complicated with fears and expectations. "And what if I always want you here? Doesn't that count for something?" Before Isabella could formulate an answer that wouldn't crush the little girl's hopes while still maintaining realistic expectations, the sound of the elevator arriving in the penthouse drew their attention. Vincent was returning earlier than expected from whatever business meeting had required his attention for most of the day, and something in his careful movements suggested that the encounter hadn't gone entirely according to plan. "Papa," Sophia called, abandoning her homework to run toward the entrance. "You're home early. Did your meeting go well?" Vincent's smile for his daughter was genuine despite the tension Isabella could see in his shoulders, the careful way he moved suggesting soreness or injury he was trying to hide. "It went exactly as expected, Principessa," he said, lifting Sophia easily despite whatever discomfort he was experiencing. "How was your day with Isabella?" As Sophia launched into detailed descriptions of their afternoon activities, Isabella studied Vincent's appearance with growing concern. His expensive suit jacket was missing, his white shirt was wrinkled in ways that suggested physical activity, and there was a cut on his knuckles that hadn't been there when he'd left that morning. When he thought neither she nor Sophia were looking, he pressed a hand briefly to his ribs in a gesture that confirmed her suspicions about his condition. After Sophia was settled with her evening snack and homework, Isabella approached Vincent in the kitchen where he was attempting to make coffee one-handed while favoring his left side. "You're hurt," she said without preamble, noting how he stiffened at her observation. "Nothing serious," he replied, though the careful way he moved contradicted his dismissive tone. "Just some minor disagreements that required physical resolution." The euphemistic language didn't disguise the reality of what had happened, and Isabella found herself moving closer despite every instinct that warned against getting involved in the violent aspects of his world. "You should let me take a look," she said, surprised by her own boldness. "I worked as a medical assistant for 6 months before the restaurant job. I know basic first aid." Vincent's green-gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how her offer might be interpreted, how crossing from employee to caregiver represented a shift in their carefully maintained boundaries. But Sophia's safety and happiness depend on his well-being, Isabella told herself, using concern for the little girl to justify her desire to help the man who had become increasingly important to her own sense of security. "That would be helpful," Vincent admitted finally, his acceptance revealing just how much discomfort he was experiencing. "There's a first aid kit in my bathroom upstairs." The master suite was another reminder of the vast differences between their worlds. All marble surfaces and expensive furnishings arranged with masculine elegance. But it was the photographs on the nightstand that caught Isabella's attention again, images of Vincent and his late wife in moments of obvious happiness and love. The woman had been beautiful in an effortless way that made Isabella suddenly conscious of her own simple clothes and practical appearance. Vincent emerged from the walk-in closet wearing only dark pants, and Isabella's breath caught involuntarily at her first clear view of the body that expensive suits had only hinted at. His torso was a map of controlled power and old violence, broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist marked by scars that told stories she wasn't sure she wanted to know. But it was the fresh bruising along his ribs and the defensive wounds on his arms that focused her attention on immediate concerns rather than dangerous attraction. "This looks worse than minor disagreements," she said, keeping her voice clinical while her heart raced from proximity to so much exposed male strength. "You could have a cracked rib." Vincent's slight smile acknowledged both her medical assessment and her obvious attempt to maintain professional distance. "I've had cracked ribs before," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed so she could access the injuries more easily. "This doesn't feel that severe." Working in careful silence, Isabella cleaned the cuts and assessed the bruising with hands that trembled slightly from more than just concern about his injuries. Vincent's skin was warm under her fingers, and she found herself hyper-aware of his controlled breathing and the subtle tension in muscles that spoke of power held carefully in check. When had touching another person stopped feeling like a potential threat and started feeling like coming home? "Your knuckles took the worst of it," she observed, wrapping clean gauze around his hand with practiced efficiency. "Whatever you hit it hard and repeatedly." "Sometimes negotiations require emphasis," Vincent replied, his voice carrying dry humor that made her look up into eyes that were studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Thank you for taking care of this. Most people in my world wouldn't offer such kindness to someone in my position." The comment revealed depths to his isolation that Isabella hadn't considered, reminding her that power and wealth couldn't protect against loneliness or the need for genuine human connection. When was the last time someone had taken care of Vincent Torino simply because they wanted him to feel better? When had anyone in his world offered comfort without expecting something in return? "Sophia worries about you," she said softly, using concern for his daughter to justify the caring that was becoming increasingly difficult to disguise. "She needs to know you're safe and healthy." "And what about you?" Vincent asked quietly, his hand coming up to cover hers where it rested on his freshly bandaged ribs. "Do you worry about me too?" The question hung between them like a confession, acknowledging the shift in their relationship that both had been trying to ignore for weeks. Isabella found herself looking into eyes that held both vulnerability and desire, seeing the man behind the dangerous reputation who had somehow become essential to her sense of safety and belonging. "Yes," she whispered, the admission escaping before she could consider its implications. "I worry about you more than I should." Vincent's thumb traced gently across her knuckles, the simple touch sending warmth through her entire body in ways that reminded her how long it had been since anyone had touched her with tenderness rather than violence. When he began to lean closer, when she found herself tilting toward him as if drawn by invisible force, the moment felt both inevitable and terrifying. The spell was broken by Sophia's frightened cry from down the hall, the sound of distress that could penetrate any adult preoccupation. Both Isabella and Vincent moved immediately toward the little girl's room, their personal moment forgotten in the face of parental concern that felt natural despite the complicated circumstances. They found Sophia sitting up in bed with tears streaming down her face, caught in the grip of whatever nightmare had shattered her sleep. "Papa," she sobbed, reaching for Vincent with the desperate need of a child, seeking comfort from the person who represented safety in her world. "I'm here, Principessa," Vincent murmured, gathering her into his arms despite the obvious discomfort the movement caused his injured ribs. "You're safe. Nothing can hurt you here." Isabella watched the interaction with a heart that ached from emotions she couldn't name, seeing how completely Vincent's protective instincts took over when Sophia needed him. This was what unconditional love looked like, what it meant to be someone's entire world in the way that children needed their parents to be. Without conscious thought, she found herself sitting on the other side of Sophia's bed, her hands smoothing gently through the little girl's dark hair while Vincent held her close. The three of them formed a circle of comfort that felt like the family Isabella had always dreamed of but never believed she deserved. "I dreamed the bad men took you away," Sophia whispered against her father's chest. "I dreamed they hurt you and you couldn't come home to me." Vincent's eyes met Isabella's over his daughter's head, sharing a moment of understanding about the costs of the life he'd chosen and the fears that haunted everyone he loved. "No one is going to take me away from you," he promised, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "And Isabella is here too. We're both here to keep you safe." The inclusion in his promise surprised Isabella, suggesting that Vincent saw her as more than temporary help or casual protection. When Sophia reached for her with one small hand while clinging to her father with the other, Isabella felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what family could mean and what she might be willing to risk to protect it. After Sophia finally returned to peaceful sleep, Vincent and Isabella found themselves back in the kitchen sharing coffee and the kind of late-night conversation that revealed more than either had intended. The near kiss in his bedroom had changed something between them, acknowledging attraction that could no longer be dismissed as simple gratitude or physical proximity. "She told me today that she hopes I'll stay forever," Isabella said quietly, staring into her coffee cup rather than meeting Vincent's penetrating gaze. "She wants us to be a real family." "And what did you tell her?" Vincent asked, though something in his tone suggested her answer mattered more than simple concern for his daughter's emotional well-being. "The truth," Isabella replied, "that this is a work arrangement, and when you don't need my help anymore, I'll have to leave." Vincent was quiet for so long that Isabella finally looked up to find him studying her with an expression she couldn't read. "What if I said I don't want you to leave?" he asked finally. "What if I said that what started as protection has become something more important than I expected?" Before Isabella could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal how desperately she wanted him to mean those words, Vincent's phone buzzed with the kind of urgent notification that meant business couldn't wait. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and Vincent's expression shifted immediately into the focused concentration that meant serious problems requiring immediate attention. "I have to take this," he said, his tone apologetic but firm. "But Isabella, we need to finish this conversation soon. There are things you need to know about the changes happening in my world, and decisions we need to make about your safety." The call with Marcus was brief but clearly concerning, conducted in the kind of coded language that told Isabella everything and nothing about the new threats emerging in Vincent's complicated world. When he finished, his expression was grim in ways that made her stomach clench with renewed anxiety. "There's been some movement from rival families," he said without preamble. "Nothing immediate, but enough that I need to increase security for everyone I care about, including you." The words sent a chill through Isabella that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, reminding her that Vincent's protection came with dangers she was only beginning to understand. But before she could process the full implications of what he was saying, her own phone rang with a number that made her blood freeze in recognition. Elena Santos was calling again, and this time she knew she couldn't simply ignore the contact and hope he would eventually give up. The expression on Vincent's face suggested he understood exactly what that phone call represented and what her continued fear meant for all of their safety. "Don't answer it," he said quietly, but his tone carried the kind of deadly calm that suggested Elena's persistent harassment had just become a much more serious problem than simple stalking. "I have to," Isabella whispered, knowing that ignoring Elena's escalating behavior would only make his eventual confrontation more dangerous for everyone she'd come to care about. But as she reached for the phone, Vincent's hand covered hers with gentle firmness. "No," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "From now on, you don't face anything alone. Elena Santos has just made the mistake of threatening someone under my protection, and that's a problem I know exactly how to solve." The promise in his words was both comforting and terrifying, offering safety that came with a cost Isabella was only beginning to understand. But looking into his eyes, seeing the genuine care mixed with dangerous determination, she realized that some lines, once crossed, changed everything that came after. She was no longer just Sophia's temporary companion or Vincent's employee. She was family now, with all the protection and danger that status entailed. 2 weeks of shared mornings had created an intimacy that felt both precious and dangerous, a domestic routine that made it increasingly difficult for Isabella to remember why she couldn't stay forever. She would wake to the sound of Vincent making coffee in the kitchen, Sophia's laughter echoing through the penthouse as she shared some story from her dreams. And for brief moments Isabella could pretend this was her real life rather than a temporary arrangement born from necessity and fear. This particular Thursday morning felt different from the moment she opened her eyes, though she couldn't identify the source of her unease. Vincent had left early for a meeting with his accountants, legitimate business that didn't require coded conversations or careful euphemisms, and Sophia was preparing for school with the kind of excited energy that suggested something special was planned for her day. Isabella, Sophia said over breakfast, her small face serious with the weight of whatever she wanted to discuss. Can I ask you something important? Of course, sweetheart, Isabella replied, setting aside her coffee to give the little girl her complete attention. You can ask me anything. If I wanted to call you almost Mama, would that be okay? Sophia asked, her voice small but hopeful. I know you're not my real mama, but you take care of me like she did. And you make Papa smile the way she used to in the pictures. The innocent request hit Isabella like a physical blow, revealing the depth of Sophia's attachment and the family dynamic that had developed without any of them fully acknowledging it. She found herself thinking of her own childhood, of the mother figures she'd invented in her imagination to fill the void left by parents who'd been too consumed by their own problems to provide the love and stability every child deserved. I would be honored if you wanted to call me that, Isabella said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze Sophia's small hand. But you should probably ask your father how he feels about it first. This is his decision too. Sophia's smile was radiant with the kind of pure joy that reminded Isabella why protecting children was worth any sacrifice, why some things mattered more than safety or self-preservation. Papa already said it was okay, she confided. He said if I felt like you were family, then you were family no matter what anybody else said. The revelation that Vincent had not only approved but encouraged Sophia's emotional attachment suggested a level of commitment to their arrangement that Isabella hadn't dared to hope for. But before she could process the full implications of what Sophia had shared, the sound of Vincent's phone ringing in the distance drew her attention to business calls that couldn't be ignored even during family breakfast time. Mrs. Chan appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that immediately set Isabella's nerves on edge, the kind of careful neutrality that household staff perfected when delivering potentially troubling news. Miss Romano, she said quietly, there's a man at the main desk asking questions about you. The doorman thought you should be informed. Isabella's blood ran cold as Mrs. Chun described the visitor, recognizing Elena Santos from details that could only come from someone who'd been watching and planning for exactly this kind of opportunity. Somehow he tracked her to Vincent's building. Somehow he discovered her new living situation despite all their precautions about keeping her location private. Is Papa in danger because of the bad man? Sophia asked, her innocent question cutting straight to the heart of Isabella's worst fears. The little girl's safety had become more important than anything else in Isabella's world, and the thought that her past might bring violence into Sophia's life was unbearable. Before Isabella could formulate a reassuring answer that wouldn't be an outright lie, Vincent's voice carried from the living room where he was conducting what sounded like an increasingly urgent conversation with Marcus. The tone suggested that Elena's appearance wasn't the only threat they were facing, that forces were converging in ways that threatened everyone Isabella had come to love. Vincent appeared in the kitchen doorway with his phone still pressed to his ear, his expression shifting immediately from business concentration to sharp concern as he noted the tension in both Isabella's posture and Mrs. Chen's careful demeanor. He ended the call abruptly and focused completely on the immediate situation. What's wrong? He asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer involved complications from Isabella's past that were about to become everyone's problem. Mrs. Chun repeated her description of Elena's visit while Isabella fought to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. Vincent's expression grew progressively darker as he absorbed the implications of Elena's boldness in approaching the building directly, the calculated nature of timing that suggested coordination with other threats. He knows I'm here, Isabella said unnecessarily, her voice barely above a whisper. He's been watching and waiting for the right moment to make his move. Vincent's hand settled on her shoulder with the kind of gentle strength that had become both comfort and temptation over the weeks they'd been living together. He made a mistake by coming here, Vincent said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm that Isabella had learned to recognize as far more dangerous than any display of anger. But before they could discuss strategy for dealing with Elena's escalating harassment, Vincent's phone rang again with Marcus's name appearing on the screen. The conversation that followed was brief and conducted in the kind of urgent code that meant immediate crisis, Vincent's expression shifting from concern to coldly furious as he absorbed whatever information Marcus was providing. Sophia's been taken, he said when the call ended, his words hitting Isabella like physical blows that left her struggling to breathe. Someone grabbed her on the way to school. The driver is dead, and there's been no contact yet about ransom or demands. The world tilted sideways as Isabella processed the impossible reality of Sophia's kidnapping. The sweet little girl who'd asked permission to call her almost mama now in the hands of people who would hurt a child to achieve their goals. But even through her shock and terror, Isabella could see the connection between Elena's appearance at the building and the perfectly timed attack on Vincent's most vulnerable point. "This is because of me," she said, the words scraping against her throat like broken glass. "Elena must have made some kind of deal, used information about Sophia to get to both of us." Vincent's green-gray eyes, when they met hers, held a fury so controlled and deadly that it transformed his entire presence into something that belonged in nightmares rather than family kitchens. But when he spoke, his voice remained carefully modulated for her emotional state rather than his own rage. "This is because someone made the mistake of threatening my family," he said, the word family carrying weight that made Isabella's heart race despite the circumstances. "And that's a mistake they won't survive to regret." The next few hours passed in a blur of controlled violence and military precision that revealed depths to Vincent's organization that Isabella had only glimpsed during business dinners. His penthouse transformed into a command center where men appeared with weapons and communications equipment, where conversations were conducted in the kind of strategic language that planned wars rather than negotiations. Marcus arrived within minutes of the first call, his usually calm demeanor replaced by the focused intensity of someone preparing for battle. The men who followed him moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke of extensive training and absolute loyalty to Vincent's leadership. Isabella found herself witnessing the full scope of the empire that protected Sophia's innocent world, the violence that underwrote their domestic happiness. "She has to be our priority," Isabella said when Vincent began outlining rescue plans that seemed to focus more on eliminating threats than ensuring Sophia's immediate safety. "Whatever happens to Elena or Tony DeMarco or anyone else involved, Sophia comes first." Vincent's slight smile acknowledged both her protective instincts and her growing understanding of how his world operated. "Sophia is always the priority," he agreed. "But ensuring her long-term safety means eliminating the people who would use her against me permanently." Isabella found herself arguing for inclusion in the rescue mission despite every rational voice telling her that civilian involvement would complicate Vincent's carefully coordinated plans. But the thought of waiting helplessly while Sophia remained in danger was unbearable. The need to actively participate in protecting the child she'd come to love overwhelming her natural caution about violent confrontation. "You're not trained for this," Vincent said when she insisted on being part of whatever action he was planning. "Your job is to stay here where you're safe so that Sophia has someone to come home to." The patronizing dismissal ignited something fierce and protective in Isabella's chest, a maternal instinct that refused to accept benevolent exclusion when Sophia's life was at stake. "She's not just your daughter anymore," Isabella shot back, her voice carrying anger and determination that surprised them both. "I love her too, and I'm not going to sit here doing nothing while she's scared and hurt because of my past." The words hung between them like a confession, acknowledging depths of feeling that neither had been willing to name despite weeks of growing intimacy and connection. But it was Vincent's response that changed everything, the admission that escaped before he could consider its implications. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotions he'd been trying to control since the moment he'd learned of Sophia's kidnapping. "I love you both more than I thought possible. And that's why I can't lose either of you to my own need for revenge." The declaration in the middle of crisis and fear felt both perfect and terrible. The confirmation of feelings they'd both been fighting combined with the reality that their newfound family was under attack from forces that wanted to destroy everything they'd built together. But instead of joy or relief, Isabella felt only the fierce determination to prove worthy of both Vincent's love and Sophia's trust. "Then trust me to help bring her home," Isabella said, stepping closer to the man who'd become essential to her understanding of safety and belonging. "Trust me to be strong enough to face this with you instead of hiding behind your protection." The rescue operation that followed revealed facets of Vincent's personality that Isabella had sensed but never witnessed directly. The controlled violence and strategic thinking that had built his reputation in a world where weakness meant death. Elena Santos and Tony DeMarco had chosen to work together in attacking Vincent through his family, and their coordination suggested planning that went beyond simple opportunism or coincidence. The warehouse where they'd taken Sophia was isolated and defensible, the kind of location chosen by people who understood tactics and assumed they were dealing with conventional law enforcement rather than the focused fury of a man protecting his child. But Vincent's response was neither conventional nor restrained by legal considerations. His soldiers moving with lethal efficiency toward a resolution that would ensure no future threats from the same sources. Isabella found herself positioned where she could see the moment Vincent's team secured Sophia's location, the instant when his daughter's safety was confirmed and his attention could shift completely to eliminating the people responsible for threatening her. The cold calculation with which he orchestrated their permanent removal was both terrifying and oddly comforting, proof that nothing would ever threaten his family twice. Sophia was physically unharmed but emotionally shaken when they brought her out, her small arms reaching immediately for both Vincent and Isabella with the desperate need of a child who'd been truly frightened for the first time in her protected life. But even through her tears and trembling, she managed to whisper her gratitude for the rescue that had brought her safely home. After Sophia was settled and sleeping peacefully in her own bed, exhausted by trauma but comforted by the absolute certainty of her father's protection, Vincent and Isabella found themselves alone in his study with the weight of everything that had changed between them in a single day. "I meant what I said during the crisis," Vincent said without preamble, his green-gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear or adrenaline. "I love you, Isabella, not just as Sophia's caregiver or as temporary help, but as the woman I want to build a life with." The declaration came with an understanding of what accepting his love would mean, the dangerous world she would be choosing, and the responsibilities that came with being Vincent Torino's partner rather than his employee. But looking into his eyes, seeing the genuine devotion mixed with hope and vulnerability, Isabella realized that some choices were worth any risk. "I love you too," she said, the words carrying weight that transformed everything between them. "I love you both more than I ever thought possible, and I'm not going anywhere." When Vincent pulled her into his arms and kissed her with the desperation of a man who'd almost lost everything that mattered, Isabella felt the last of her carefully maintained boundaries dissolve completely. This was commitment and partnership and the kind of love that changed everything, dangerous and beautiful and absolutely worth whatever came next. She was choosing Vincent's world with full knowledge of its costs and dangers, choosing to be Sophia's mother in every way that mattered, choosing love over safety and family over self-preservation. And as Vincent's lips moved against hers with promises and passion and hope for their future, Isabella knew she would never regret the decision to fight for the family they'd built together. 1 month after the crisis that had tested every bond between them, Isabella stood in Vincent's kitchen watching Sophia practice her flower girl walk across the marble floors with the kind of serious concentration that 80-year-olds brought to important responsibilities. The wedding was still 3 weeks away, but Sophia had appointed herself director of every detail that involved her participation, from the perfect way to scatter rose petals to the precise timing of her entrance down the aisle. The transformation in their daily life had been both subtle and profound, shifting from the careful boundaries of employer and employee to the natural intimacy of a family that had chosen each other through crisis and commitment. Vincent no longer disappeared behind the polite mask of business formality when he looked at her, and Isabella had stopped cataloging exit strategies or maintaining emotional distance from the man who had become essential to her understanding of home. Mrs. Chun had embraced Isabella's permanent presence with the kind of maternal approval that suggested the older woman had been hoping for exactly this development since the day Isabella first defended Sophia in the restaurant. The household staff treated her with the respect due to Vincent's chosen partner rather than temporary help, understanding that her role had evolved into something far more significant than childcare or companionship. The morning routine had settled into patterns that felt like they'd existed for years rather than weeks, Vincent stealing quiet moments to kiss her goodbye before business meetings while Sophia chattered about school projects and upcoming dance recitals. Isabella found herself thinking less about the dangerous aspects of Vincent's world and more about the way he made coffee exactly how she liked it without being asked, how he remembered details about her preferences and fears and dreams that Elena had never bothered to learn. Her integration into the broader family business had happened gradually and naturally, Vincent introducing her to the legitimate enterprises that would form Sophia's inheritance while carefully excluding her from the more dangerous operations that still required his direct attention. Isabella discovered she had a natural talent for restaurant management and customer service, skills that had been wasted in her previous survival jobs but found perfect expression in the upscale dining establishments that anchored the Torino family's legal investments. Sophia had begun calling her mama without qualification or hesitation, the title-carrying weight that made Isabella's heart clench with emotions she'd never expected to experience. The little girl had needed a mother figure more than Isabella had realized, someone to braid her hair for special occasions and answer questions about growing up that Vincent, despite his devoted parenting, couldn't fully address from personal experience. The first family dinner with Vincent's extended organization had been both terrifying and oddly comforting, revealing how completely she'd been accepted into a world that rarely welcomed outsiders. Marcus had offered his friendship and protection with genuine warmth, understanding that Isabella's happiness was essential to Vincent's well-being and Sophia's continued security. The other wives and partners in their circle had embraced her with stories and advice about navigating the unique challenges of loving men, whose work required absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty. Vincent's mother had traveled from Sicily for the wedding, a small, elegant woman in her 70s whose sharp intelligence and protective instincts had clearly shaped her son's character. She spoke limited English but communicated approval through gestures and expressions that transcended language barriers, holding Isabella's hands while explaining in rapid Italian that Vincent had been lonely for too long and Sophia needed the kind of maternal love that only came from choice rather than obligation. The wedding planning had revealed aspects of Vincent's romantic nature that his dangerous reputation had hidden, his attention to details that would make the day special for Sophia, as well as meaningful for their own commitment. He wanted the ceremony to reflect their unique family structure, acknowledging that they were not just two people choosing each other but three people choosing to become something stronger together than they could ever be apart. Isabella's dress had been selected with Sophia's enthusiastic input, the little girl insisting that her almost mama should look like a princess from the fairy tales they read together before bedtime. But it was Vincent's expression when he saw her in the simple but elegant gown that confirmed Isabella's decision to embrace this new life completely, his green-gray eyes reflecting wonder and desire and absolute commitment to their shared future. The ceremony itself was small but perfect, conducted in the garden of Vincent's estate with only their closest family and most trusted friends in attendance. Sophia performed her flower girl duties with the kind of solemn pride that made both adults struggle against tears of joy, her obvious delight in their union confirming that this marriage represented the completion of her own deepest wishes for her father's happiness. Vincent's vows were spoken in English and Italian, his voice carrying emotions that transformed his usual controlled demeanor into something vulnerable and honest. He promised to love Isabella through whatever challenges their unusual life might bring, to protect their family with everything he possessed, and to honor the trust Sophia had placed in both of them when she'd chosen to call Isabella her mother. Isabella's vows acknowledged the courage required to choose love over safety, family over solitude, and commitment over the careful independence that had protected her from disappointment for so many years. She promised to love Vincent not despite his dangerous world, but because of his devotion to protecting everyone who mattered to him, to be the mother Sophia deserved and the partner Vincent needed in building their shared future. The reception revealed the joy that permeated their extended family when celebrating rather than conducting business, laughter and music and dancing that continued long into the evening. Isabella found herself moved by the genuine affection these dangerous men showed for Sophia, the way they competed to dance with the little girl and ensure her happiness on what she'd proclaimed the best day of her entire life. But it was the quiet moment when Vincent pulled Isabella onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife that crystallized everything she'd gained by choosing to trust his protection and accept his love. His hands were gentle despite their proven capability for violence, his voice soft as he whispered promises about their honeymoon and their future, and the family they would continue building together. Marcus approached them during a break between songs, his expression carrying the kind of serious attention that meant business considerations couldn't wait even for wedding celebrations. "There's been word from the commission about territorial adjustments," he said quietly, ensuring their conversation remained private despite the surrounding festivities. "Nothing urgent, but decisions that will need your attention next week." Vincent nodded with the kind of resignation that suggested some responsibilities couldn't be avoided even during personal celebrations. But his arm tightened around Isabella's waist in a gesture that reminded her she was now part of all his considerations. "Whatever needs to be decided, we'll handle it together," he said, the inclusion natural and absolute. The honeymoon was a week in Tuscany that felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Rolling hills and ancient architecture providing the perfect backdrop for conversations about their future that had been impossible during the crisis and chaos of their unusual courtship. Isabella learned about Vincent's plans for transitioning the family business toward more legitimate enterprises as Sophia grew older, his desire to provide his daughter with choices about her own involvement that he'd never had himself. They talked about children of their own, the possibility of giving Sophia siblings and expanding their family in ways that felt both natural and miraculous to Isabella, who had never imagined herself capable of the kind of maternal love that now shaped her daily priorities. Vincent's excitement about the prospect of more children revealed depths to his devotion to fatherhood that made Isabella fall in love with him all over again. The conversations about Isabella's role in family operations continued throughout their time in Italy, Vincent explaining the legitimate businesses that would eventually form Sophia's inheritance, while acknowledging the reality that some aspects of his work would always carry risks that couldn't be completely eliminated. But Isabella's acceptance of those dangers had been tested and proven during Sophia's kidnapping. Her understanding that loving Vincent meant embracing his entire world rather than trying to change its fundamental nature. When they returned to New York, Isabella found that married life with Vincent involved a level of partnership and intimacy that surpassed even her highest expectations. He consulted her about business decisions that affected their family's security, included her in strategic planning for Sophia's education and future, and showed her daily that her opinions and preferences were essential to his own happiness and sense of completion. Sophia's adjustment to having a mother was seamless in the way that children adapted when their deepest needs were finally met, her confidence and joy expanding as she experienced the security of unconditional maternal love combined with her father's unwavering protection. Isabella discovered that motherhood involved a fierce protective instinct that matched Vincent's own, a willingness to defend Sophia against any threat regardless of the personal cost. The three of them settled into routines that felt like they'd existed forever rather than months. Family dinners where Sophia shared every detail of her day while Vincent and Isabella exchanged glances full of private communication and shared amusement. Isabella learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when Vincent's work required immediate attention, understanding when to handle Sophia's needs independently and when to present a united front regarding household decisions or parenting choices. Their first major crisis as a married couple came 6 months after the wedding, when rival families attempted to test Vincent's resolve by targeting the restaurant where Isabella had begun working as general manager. The attack was contained and resolved within hours, but Isabella's response to the threat confirmed that she'd fully embraced the realities of their shared life rather than simply tolerating its dangers. Instead of fear or recriminations, Isabella's primary concern was ensuring Sophia's continued safety while supporting Vincent's strategic response to the challenge. She understood that showing weakness or uncertainty would encourage additional attacks, that being Vincent's wife meant projecting strength even when faced with situations that would terrify most people. The resolution of that crisis strengthened their marriage in ways that ordinary couples never experienced, proving that their partnership could withstand the unique pressures of Vincent's world while maintaining the love and trust that formed the foundation of their relationship. Isabella discovered that she possessed reserves of courage and determination that she'd never suspected, maternal and protective instincts that made her a valuable ally rather than simply a person who needed protection. Their first anniversary was celebrated quietly at home with Sophia, a family dinner where they exchanged gifts and shared memories of the year that had transformed all three of their lives completely. Sophia presented Isabella with a drawing of their family that included a new addition, a baby sister that the little girl had been hoping for with the kind of persistent optimism that children brought to their deepest wishes. The timing of Sophia's artistic prediction proved remarkably accurate, as Isabella discovered 2 weeks later that she was carrying Vincent's child, a development that filled all three of them with excitement and wonder about their expanding family. Vincent's reaction to the pregnancy revealed depths to his happiness that Isabella had never seen, his careful protectiveness extending to include considerations about their unborn child's safety and future. Sophia's excitement about becoming a big sister provided entertainment and joy throughout Isabella's pregnancy, the little girl appointing herself as chief advisor about baby care and nursery decoration. Her questions about pregnancy and birth gave Isabella opportunities to share maternal wisdom while learning about the kind of family traditions they wanted to establish for their own children. Have you ever found love in the most unexpected place? With someone who changed everything you thought you knew about yourself? Maybe you're watching this from a place where you never expected to find happiness, where circumstances brought you someone who became your whole world. I'd love to hear about your own experiences with unexpected love that transformed everything. Share your story in the comments because sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones that choose each other. The birth of Maria Isabella Torino 8 months later completed their family in ways that felt both natural and miraculous. Vincent's wonder at holding his daughter combined with Sophia's careful attention to her new sister creating moments of pure joy that Isabella treasured above any luxury their wealth could provide. The baby's arrival strengthened rather than complicated their family dynamics, Sophia embracing her role as protective big sister while Vincent demonstrated the same devoted fatherhood that had first attracted Isabella to his character. Watching Vincent with both his daughters, seeing how completely his love encompassed every member of their family, Isabella understood that she'd found something most people spent their entire lives searching for without success. Their love had survived crisis and danger and the complicated integration of 3 separate lives into something stronger and more beautiful than any of them had imagined possible. Sophia, now 9 and supremely confident in her role as family ambassador and big sister, often told people the story of how Isabella had saved her from the mean man in the restaurant and how that had led to her father finding true love. The little girl's version of events emphasized the fairy tale aspects while understanding perfectly that real love required choice and courage and commitment that went far beyond simple attraction or convenience. 2 years after their wedding, Isabella stood in the kitchen of their new restaurant, a family establishment that bore Sophia's name and served as both legitimate business and gathering place for their extended family. She was discussing menu changes with the head chef when a commotion near the front entrance drew her attention to a familiar scene that made her heart race with protective instinct. A little boy, perhaps 6 years old, was sitting alone at a corner table while an aggressive manager berated him for taking up space without ordering enough food. The child's obvious fear and the adult's bullying behavior triggered every maternal and protective response Isabella had developed through loving Sophia and embracing Vincent's world. Without hesitation, she crossed the dining room to confront the situation, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from knowing she had backup and support for whatever action she chose to take. The manager's expression shifted from aggression to uncertainty as he recognized Isabella's position in the restaurant hierarchy and the family that owned it. The little boy looked up at her with gratitude and wonder, his small voice trembling as he thanked her for intervening on his behalf. But this time, Isabella wasn't alone in her protective response. Vincent appeared beside her within moments, having witnessed the confrontation from across the restaurant, his presence adding weight to Isabella's intervention while confirming that their family would always stand together against bullies and predators. Sophia materialized at Isabella's other side, now old enough to understand the significance of defending children who couldn't protect themselves, her fierce expression suggesting she'd inherited both her father's protective instincts and her mother's courage in facing down injustice. The 3 of them formed a united front that made the manager's position untenable, their obvious solidarity ensuring the little boy's safety while demonstrating the kind of family strength that had grown from their individual courage. The scene resolved quickly and definitively, the manager's employment terminated immediately, while the little boy was welcomed as an honored guest whose safety and comfort became the restaurant's primary concern. But it was the way Vincent's hand settled on Isabella's shoulder, the way Sophia stepped closer to show her support, that reminded Isabella how completely their family had been transformed by love and choice and mutual protection. Later that evening, after Sophia was asleep and baby Maria was settled in her crib, Isabella and Vincent sat together in their study, reviewing the day's events and marveling at how their family's story had come full circle. The woman who had once defended a stranger's child despite personal cost was now in a position to ensure that protection extended to any child who needed it, backed by resources and authority that made her intervention meaningful rather than simply brave. Vincent's arms around her felt like home and safety and partnership, the kind of love that had grown stronger through testing rather than weaker through familiarity. Their marriage had survived the unique challenges of his dangerous world, while maintaining the tenderness and passion that had brought them together despite impossible circumstances. "I love our life," Isabella said softly, the simple statement encompassing everything they'd built together and everything they still hoped to achieve as their family continued growing and changing. Vincent's smile carried satisfaction and wonder and absolute commitment to their shared future. His voice warm with emotions that had only deepened through marriage and parenthood and the daily choice to build something beautiful together. "I love our life too," he replied, his hand finding hers with the automatic gesture of a man who'd found his perfect partner. "And I love that we're just getting started." Outside the windows of their penthouse, the city sparkled with possibilities and promises. But inside their home was everything that mattered most: love and family, and the security that came from choosing each other every single day. Sophia sleeping peacefully in her room, baby Maria dreaming in her crib, and the two adults who had fought for the right to call this miraculous combination their own family. Isabella's journey from frightened waitress to beloved wife and mother had required courage she'd never known she possessed. Trust in a man whose world challenged every assumption she'd made about safety and love, and faith that some fairy tales were worth the risks required to make them real. But looking at their wedding photo on Vincent's desk, seeing Sophia's radiant smile and baby Maria's tiny hand wrapped around her finger, Isabella knew that every moment of fear and uncertainty had led to this perfect life she'd never dared to dream possible. The woman who had once stood alone against bullies now stood surrounded by the kind of love and protection that made anything possible. Her family's strength multiplied by their unity and commitment to defending each other against any threat. Vincent's dangerous world had become her world, but more importantly, her love had transformed his understanding of what family could mean and what he was willing to fight to protect. Their love story had begun with a moment of unexpected courage in a restaurant, but it had grown into something that would last forever, sustained by choice and commitment, and the daily miracle of three people becoming stronger together than they'd ever been apart. Isabella fell asleep that night in Vincent's arms, dreaming of the future they would continue building together, secure in the knowledge that some loves are worth every risk and some families are worth fighting for with everything you have. In the end, the waitress who had defended a stranger's child had found herself defending her own family, supported by a man whose love had given her the strength to become everything she'd never known she could be. And in a world where fairy tales rarely came true, they had created their own happy ending through courage and choice and the kind of love that conquered every fear.